Hi, I'm Wes Allen with Damn Tales, and today I'm looking at a game I've wanted to review for a long while. This is my look at low fantasy gaming. Let's roll it. So low fantasy gaming is actually the predecessor game for another game that I reviewed on my channel earlier this year, Low Life 2090. It's neat for me to see how the mechanics have evolved from one game to the other, but the general engine remains the same. So let's take a look at how this book is structured, and then we'll get into the game design itself. Low Fantasy Gaming is a 286-page book. I have the hardback premium cover here. It is pretty thick. Print on demand, so it is a glued binding, not a stitch binding. But it does feel very good in the hand, and the hardback really gives it a lot of sturdiness when you're trying to read it, particularly if you're sitting with it on your lap. I would recommend for a book this size always to get the hardback book. It is printed on flat paper, and it has a nice subtle brown texture, which is almost unnoticeable. And the combination of the flat paper and that subtle brown texture almost makes it easier to read, which I really appreciate. There's not so much glare coming off the page. It uses the same sans serif font for both the text itself and for the headers, and I do love the color that they picked for the header text there. Very nice. Now, the tables are okay. There is a healthy cell padding so that they aren't cramped, but I do think that the alternating row color is a little bit too subtle. It doesn't really have an impact on the PDF where the alternating rows really do stand out, but here it almost blends too much into the subtle texture in the background so that it doesn't have the same effect as if it would be just a tad bit darker. When you're reading it head on, the color just seems to fade away. From an angle, and I'm looking at it here under a light, it actually shows up, but in general reading conditions, I haven't really found it that accessible. There are some tables, particularly the attack bonus tables, where it shows progression, where they did a strange thing to have the table wrap. This is one thing I really don't like. I almost would have liked to have it broken into two different tables and had that header row really break off so that it would be easier to really follow it right away. It doesn't take long to figure out what's going on, but the first glance at the table, I was like, what is happening here? And it took me just a second to see that second level row going up to level 12 there. The artwork in this book is absolutely gorgeous. You have full page spreads that have almost a watercolor feel. You have the half page artwork that really shows kind of the danger of doing a dungeon crawl in low fantasy gaming. And then the character artwork for the classes is really fascinating. It has very heavy lines and some beautiful inking. It feels very much like the best of comic book art, and I very much appreciate it. The barbarian right there is just stunning to me. That's one of the standout pieces of character art in the game. So in this game, you have 7 primary attributes: strength, dexterity, intelligence, constitution, and charisma. The 7th is actually a split of what would entail wisdom in older games or Dungeons & Dragons itself, and that becomes perception and willpower. These cover those two different aspects of how wisdom is often triggered. The attributes in the game are modified in a way that's a little bit more generous than a lot of OSR games. If you have a 9 to 12, that's considered average, so that pretty much pans out. A 13 to 14 is +1, 15 and 16 is +2, and a 17 and 18 is +3. Kind of like the way that this works, because the way the engine of the game functions, along with the more generous nature of giving your modifiers to your rolls, it really makes your ability scores mean more, and I really like that. There is one other attribute in this game that is variable, and that is luck. Players start with a base 10, and then they can add on top of that 1/2 their level rounded up. So a first level character starts with 11 luck, and this is going to change throughout the course of the game. We'll get to that in a little bit. There are 5 races in this game, but it is by design meant to be human-centric. The different races do have their own abilities, but none of them are great buffs or really make them stand out in a crowd over and above humans. Probably the best thing they get are bonuses to their saving throws. They don't have dark vision, which is always a plus for me, and there are no attribute modifiers for the different races, which is something I really appreciate. So each race feels non-human, but not overpoweringly so. There's no reason in this game that you would ever say, well, why would I want to bother playing a human? Because humans really stand up with the best of them. There are 9 classes in this game, and there's a really good mix of some older archetypes and new twists on things. The artificers and the fighters, the magic users, the thieves, the rangers, the barbarians, and the monks, well, they all really feel like their old school counterparts. In this game, however, magic users are a tad bit different. They can wear armor. They can also carry swords because magic in this game is otherworldly and scary, and you don't want to be relying on it all the time because bad things can happen. And I really like this about the game. The magic user has this extra question that they need to ask. Is it really essential for me to use my magic in this part of the adventure? Or I'm going to save that for later just to make sure nothing bad happens. It's pretty cool. We're going to talk about magic in a little bit. The biggest change in this game is probably with clerics. They are called cultists in this game. They do not have Vancian style magic in their prayers. They have to ask for boons from their patron deity. And in fact, the deities in this world are rather distant, so they're not necessarily going to hear you. I like the different feel for how cultists work in this game. They're not just magic users with a different skin, and that's really kind of cool. It's rather interesting to see how low fantasy gaming reskins these characters in a way that's both familiar and yet very alien to what people might expect if they come from a game that they're familiar with, like Dungeons and Dragons. Character advancement is a nice mix. You get your hit point buffs as you would normally get, and characters do start with full hit points at first level, and they can increase rather quickly, so that's kind of nice. They're a little bit sturdier than maybe a first level character in old school Essentials. And when they level up, not only do they get their hit point buffs, they often will get some character class abilities that come into play as they advance. But every third level, they get something that's really cool, a unique feature. Unique features are oftentimes abilities that are tied to other classes, and they might be toned down just a bit. What's neat about it, however, is because suddenly these characters have these class abilities that are tied to other classes, you are essentially multi-classing if you pull certain feats out or certain unique features out. And this is the way they handle it. It gets away from the trap of other games of being forced to level up over like 3 times the amount of time, or having to make that bargain between want to level up to the next level of paladin or taking a level of thief so I can do these things as well. And I like the way that they've handled this. It makes each character very customizable without slowing play down or becoming too crunchy. There's not a whole lot of extra work that needs to get done to add these unique features to characters. And even better, the list that's given in the rulebook is specifically said to be an example. GMs and players are encouraged to come together to create their unique features that fit their setting. And this really allows the GM and the players to make a world that is unique to their own table, using what's in the book as a guide. One of the other interesting things that makes low fantasy gaming very different from a lot of other old school revival games is I can't find any encumbrance rules. Now, I've read this book like 3 times and I haven't found them yet, so there is the possibility that I've completely skipped over it. I actually need to go surf the PDF to see, but I haven't seen it. It just seems like low fantasy gaming's point is, well, just use common sense. Your character cannot put a 3-ton statue on their back and lug it into town 15 miles away. That's just not going to work. But we're not going to ding you for having 3 sets of clothes and an extra pair of socks, and suddenly you can't move in combat anymore. This is a really nice balance point that low fantasy gaming tries to do over and over and over again, and succeeds more often than not. Everything is left up to the GM's discretion, but the GM is supposed to be working in concert with the players. This is not an adversarial relationship. So if at a point the GM decides, well, you just picked up probably 70 pounds of gold, so maybe you're going to be moving 10 foot less next combat encounter until you can drop some of that weight. Not a lot of fiddling to go on, but it's still something that's in play. You have to use your common sense that way. Magic in this world is supposed to be a little bit frightening and otherworldly. As I said, there's only one class in the game that uses Vancian style magic, and that is the magic user. Every time they want to cast a spell, they have to roll a d20. The first time they roll, if they hit a 1, a dark and dangerous magic effect has been triggered. This is a percentile table that they have to roll on. Some of the effects are very minimal and they don't last very long. Others of them are rather long-lasting and can have some serious effects on the player. And I like the way that this works. Every time the player rolls, if they don't get a dark and dangerous magic effect, the number to hit to trigger one goes up by 1. So after 4 or 5 times where you're doing it, you can suddenly get to a 6 or under to trigger one of these effects. And as the adventure goes on, the magic user starts to have to think to themselves, does this situation really require me using my magic, or do I want to wield my sword here? Because now I'm up to a 30% chance of something going crazy because I'm at a 6, and we're going to hit a boss figure at some point in the near future, and maybe I don't want to be triggering the effect then. This is a lot different than the, well, I'm just going to fire my magic missile and just be done with it, that you have in older style games, and I appreciate what they have tried to do here. The one interesting thing that I might not like about how low fantasy gaming handles magic is they've changed the names of all the spells. They have a translation guide in the back of the book in one of the indexes so you can try to figure out which is which. But when you get started out, it's a little difficult to figure out like what magic missile is supposed to be. Now, I get why they did this. It fits the idea of the game. Magic is distant and otherworldly, so the spells are of course going to have these exotic and different names that feel like they don't belong in common parlance the way I Cast Web does. You see the difference there? I appreciate it. It's great color. It's a little bit more difficult to jump into. So I'm very glad that they gave us an index to determine what the different spells actually are. Maybe would have liked more pointing to that in the magic section than I got. So let's talk the engine. Just like Low Life 2090, Low Fantasy Gaming is a roll under mechanic. You have a d20, you have to hit your attribute score or under in order to succeed. But that is not the end of the story. If you happen to roll your dice and you roll 1/2 of your attribute score, so if you have a 10, that's a 5, and by the way, you always round down for this, that's considered a great success. This is something that's going to have very strong narrative consequences inside the game and maybe some mechanical benefit in the short term. If you are rolling and you roll 1/2 above your ability score, so if you have a 10, that would be a 15, and again, you round down, that's going to be a terrible failure. And this is going to have significant long-lasting narrative effects and maybe some mechanical effects in the short term for that character. So say you are trying to unlock a door and discover where the trap is and you get a great success. Well, then maybe you can recognize automatically where all the traps are in that section of a dungeon because they were made by the same person. That's kind of cool. Or if you are trying to pickpocket someone random on the street and you have a terrible failure, well, then maybe they are a captain of the guard and they were on a sting operation and they have 14 guards surrounding you at that point, and now you have to fight for your life or run away. And that's a good, terrible failure. Narrative changes to the game because of what the characters attempted to do, working in conjunction with the dice. This is something I'm seeing a lot more of in games that try to give you this sense of it's more than just succeed or fail. And I think Pickpocket Press has done it the best out of any of the ones that I've seen. So there are different kinds of checks in the game. The most common one is going to be an ability check, which I've already mentioned. You roll the d20 and you have to roll your applicable attribute score or under in order to succeed. This is going to be the majority of the checks that a player does in the game outside of combat. One of the cooler checks is a luck check. So we talked about that luck score earlier on and how a first level character will have a luck score of 11. there might be an effect that happens. They trigger a trap and there's poison gas that comes out, or a breath weapon fires at you, and you can make a luck check to either have or avoid damage. So you roll your d20 and you roll under your score, and if you succeed, you don't take damage, and if you fail, you take the damage. Pretty easy, right? Well, remember how we talked about how the luck score is variable. If you succeed at a luck check, your luck score is reduced by 1. So every time that you succeed at something, every time you avoid a trap, every time you dodge a breath weapon or resist a spell, your luck score goes down by 1. The longer an adventure goes, the harder and harder it's going to be to avoid those effects. And so luck becomes that attribute that you have to really hold on to and keep it as something precious that you don't want to lose, because at the worst time, if you have a low score of luck all of a sudden because you've dodged everything because you've been walking through a dungeon willy-nilly, suddenly you fail and everything's gotten messed up. There's another alternative to a luck roll, which is just luck, and then in parentheses, you'll have one of the attributes. For these rolls, you're allowed to add your attribute modifier to your luck score. So if you have a luck of 10, but a dexterity of 18, and it was a luck dex check, you have to roll under a 13. And, it's a nice way to tie in your attributes to your luck. You can be lucky and good at the same time. Overall, I love this system. It makes the attribute scores matter, which is something that people complain about all the time with Dungeons and Dragons. The only thing that matters is the modifier. Not in low fantasy gaming. In low fantasy gaming, they are important, and that's great. Combat in the game is like most other modern games out there now. It's a d20 roll, and it's ascending AC, which means you have to beat the opponent's armor class in order to succeed with your attack. I almost would have appreciated seeing Pickpocket Press keep descending armor class in this game, because every other roll is a roll under mechanic, and it would have made a lower armor class better again in a way that actually made sense, unlike back in the day where you had your combat matrices and you had THAC0 and all that sort of stuff. I understand them. I like ascending AC better, just to let you know. But you could have had your cake and eaten it too with this. A roll under descending armor class system would have been great. Probably would have blown people's minds up, which is why they didn't do it, but I almost wish they would have tried. Initiative in the game is a dexterity check, and just like with Low Life 2090, I love the way that it works. If you have a success, you go before the creatures. If you fail your dexterity check, you go after the creatures. If you have a great success, you can go ahead of what's considered to be boss monsters or heavy creatures inside the game. These are creatures that have specific bonuses and buffs, then a special trait in their character line that lets them know we're going to go before the party unless they do this. These are the toughies that you really have to go against. You have great success, you can go ahead of them. Otherwise, they're going first. Really kind of cool. And a terrible failure, you're just going after everybody. So you essentially have a group initiative concept, but there's different tiers to where the different character groups are going to function. And where the PCs go, the party can determine themselves as to who's going what. They can coordinate as they go through, and this is encouraged. And I love the way this is handled. It's a rather unique system, and it just gets away from, well, I rolled a 6, so I'm going here. What makes low fantasy gaming rather special, however, are these things called exploits. You can trigger them when you have a successful attack, so you have to hit. And there's two kinds, major exploits and minor exploits. A minor exploit requires an ability check, an attribute check. And it can affect one character in the combat and really has a limited duration, usually one combat turn. The example that's given in the book is throwing sand in your opponent's eyes. If you succeed on a dexterity check, then that character is blinded for one turn, and they have all the penalties associated with combat with being blinded for that turn. And if they fail, then they miss and the character's fine. Major exploit doesn't only require an attribute check, it also requires a luck check, because you're trying to do something significant that can impact more than one character in the combat and can have long-lasting effects. You are trying to disarm an opponent. You're trying to hit the switch that floods that section. It makes everybody run away. Just like with a minor exploit, you do have to have a hit in order to trigger it. And when you roll that luck check, if you succeed, your luck score drops by 1. So there's this aspect of I have to manage my luck in order to get through this adventure successfully. Do I want the cool thing, or do I want to live to the next encounter? That's what's going on. This all makes combat storytelling rather than just roll the dice. Do I hit? Do I miss? Do I do this? I love telling the story of combat, but with the exploit feature, I really enjoy and appreciate that this gets the party to start taking part in telling the story of the combat. That's cool. Now, the back of the book has GM tools, and I have one word for this section. Whoa. I literally can't explain them all because there's just too much. One of the high points for me is a mass combat engine in the back of the game that makes the player's actions inside the combat very important. You have a certain amount of awful events that happen each turn of combat that only the players can deal with. And then you zoom out and you do the unit movement and combat phase of the combat at that time after the players go. Their successes and their failures is going to have an extreme impact on how that unit level of the game works. It is the simplest and fastest mass combat system that I have read yet. I almost just want to have a mass combat in one of my other tables so I can use it. It's really cool. It gives you some rules for travel and for random encounters, and it gives you random tables for generating dungeon rooms and things like that, the way that most games would do in the GM section. One of the most interesting things about low fantasy gaming is the way that it handles magic items. So instead of just getting a +1 sword, +2 versus giants, you have a artifact that actually would have a name, that has a known lineage. And maybe something about that name reveals something about what this weapon can eventually do. When you start out with the weapon and you attune it, you only have access to a couple of its aspects of its power. Some of these can be minor, some of these can be incredibly impactful, some are obvious, some are a little bit more subtle. But as the character advances in level, they begin to attune with a greater sense to that weapon, and maybe you start adding new aspects to it. This is a way of making magic items continue to be rare, but not getting bored with the one that you have. Instead of having a +1 sword, well, now I want to ditch this to get the +4 sword. I'm going to have this sword. This is, the cleaver of Og Hamfest, whatever you want to call it. And the first level you have, it does double damage on a 19 and a 20. But by the time you have it for 3 levels, maybe it can cast a light spell, or it can heal people. And the players can get excited about discovering what else this weapon can do. And if it ever gets handed off to another character, it just goes back down to its base because the player has to grow with the item. This is one of the most unique aspects of the game, and I love everything about it. In fact, I would love to pull this into every other one of my fantasy role-playing games to make magic items distinct and unique and powerful, but make them so you want to hang on to them for a long time because you have no idea what's going to happen. So if you want to pick up low fantasy gaming for yourself, and I do recommend picking up this game, even if you don't want to play it, there's so much inside the rule book that you can use for any table, particularly ones that are playing fantasy role-playing. You can get it at DriveThruRPG, and there are a number of formats that you can get it in. As of this recording, Low Fantasy Gaming is on sale for the next 6 days. That includes a discount of 75% off the PDF, going all the way down to $5. And if you want to get the combination of a hardcover book and the PDF, you can get that for $40 right now for the standard color book. And if you want to pay a little bit more for the premium, paper's going to be a little bit higher quality. That goes down from $90 to $56. That is a fantastic value. So I picked up a new game that I've been wanting to pick up for a couple of months. Easy D6, and I think I'm going to be reviewing that next, jumping ahead of some other games that I still want to take a look at because it is unique and cool and wild. Until then, happy playing, everyone.